4,000 years ago, someone carved into clay what happens after we die. Not as a belief, not as comfort, as if they had seen it. That text still exists. It is in a museum. Assyriologists have been translating it, fragment by fragment, for 150 years. And what it says does not resemble any heaven you have ever been promised, or any hell. It does not judge whether you were good or evil. It does not weigh your heart. It does not count your sins. It judges something entirely different, something that no one in 4,000 years expected to find. In this video, you are going to read what it says, the real translation, the exact words. And at the end, you will be left with a question that the Sumerians answered, and that we still do not know how to face. Southern Mesopotamia. Roughly 4,000 years before the present, modern-day Iraq and Syria. The Sumerians were not a fringe civilization. They built the first cities. They invented writing, cuneiform, pressed into wet clay with a reed stylus. They developed the first legal codes, the first schools, the first organized priesthoods. They also wrote with the same practical precision they used to record grain harvests and land transactions about what happens when a person dies. This is not mythology in the way we use the word, stories invented to explain what we do not understand. The scholars who study these texts are careful to distinguish. Some of this material appears in temple hymns, some in royal laments, some in what we would today call literature. The Ker, the Sumerian word for the land of the dead, also meaning the great below, appears across dozens of tablets excavated from multiple sites. The most important of those sites, Nippur in central Mesopotamia, in the south, where Sir Leonard Woolley uncovered the royal tombs in the 1920s, and Nineveh, the ancient Assyrian capital, where in 1853 Austin Henry Layard and his assistant Hormuzd Rassam began extracting from the ruins of Ashurbanipal's library, one of the largest archives of cuneiform texts ever discovered. Tens of thousands of tablets and fragments, fragment by fragment, shipped to the British Museum in London, where they still sit today. Among them, the 12 tablets of the Epic of Gilgamesh. And the 12th tablet, the one that almost nobody talks about, contains something unusual. A description, direct, specific. A man reporting from inside the land of the dead. That man was Enkidu. Let us be precise about what the texts actually say, and what the scholars who have spent their careers reading them confirm. The Ker is not a place of reward or punishment. That is the first thing the tablets establish, and it is the detail most people miss when they encounter this material filtered through modern commentary. In the Sumerian cosmology recorded in these texts, every soul goes to the same place. The righteous and the wicked, the powerful and the powerless, the king and the slave. All of them descend after death to the Ker, the great below. It is described as a house of dust, a place of darkness. The Sumerian poem known as The Death of Gilgamesh describes it as a realm where the dead eat clay, where they are clothed in feathered garments like birds, where they see no light. The word underworld does not fully capture it. The Ker is not underground in the way we picture it, a subterranean cave. It is a separate reality, below the fresh waters, below the earth's foundation, a place the living cannot access and the dead cannot leave. Assyriologist Samuel Noah Kramer, who spent decades translating Sumerian literary texts from the tablets at Nippur, described the Ker as a dark, dreary cavern located deep in the bowels of the earth. Not a hell of fire and torment, not a heaven of light and peace, something more neutral,
and in that neutrality, somehow more unsettling. Andrew George, whose 2003 critical edition of the Epic of Gilgamesh remains the standard scholarly reference, notes that Tablet 12 is unusual precisely because it appears to be a direct translation of an older Sumerian composition, older even than the rest of the epic. It was appended to the Akkadian version of the story and has a different literary character, less poetic, more documentary, more like a catalogue than the poetic narrative of the rest of the epic.
A checklist of who the dead are and what happens to each of them. In Tablet 12, Enkidu, Gilgamesh's companion who has died, returns briefly from the Kur as a spirit summoned by the god Ea. Gilgamesh asks him, "Did you see the man with one son?" Enkidu answers, "I saw him. He weeps bitterly beside his peg." "Did you see the man with two sons?" "I saw him. He sits on two bricks and eats bread." "Did you see the man with three sons? With four? With five? With seven?" The answers escalate. The man with 7 sons sits with the gods and hears the music of the divine assembly. And then Gilgamesh asks about the man who was killed in battle. Enkidu answers, "His father and his mother raise his head, and his wife weeps over him." He asks about the man who fell in the wilderness, whose body was not found. Enkidu answers, "His ghost is not at rest in the underworld." He asks about the man whose corpse was burned by fire. Enkidu answers, "His smoke went up to heaven. His ghost does not exist in the underworld." This is the detail. This is what breaks the expectation. We come to texts like these looking for judgment. We come expecting a system we recognize, something like karma, something like divine weighing of deeds, something like a moral ledger. What Tablet 12 describes is something else entirely. The fate of the dead in the Kur is determined not by how they lived, not by their virtue, their piety, or their cruelty. It is determined by the circumstances of their death, by how many children they left behind, by whether their body was found and properly buried, by whether someone on earth still lights incense for them, still pours water libations, still speaks their name. The man with no sons, and this is a direct line from the text in the rendering of the Oxford Corpus of Sumerian Literature, eats the scraps and the crumbs tossed out in the street. He receives what no one else claimed. The man who died with no one to mourn him, no funeral rites, no offerings, he is the most bereft figure in the Kur, not because he sinned, because no one remembered him. The system is not moral, it is relational. Your fate in the afterlife depends not on what you did, but on who remembered you. Think about what that means for a civilization that built its legal system, its temples, its entire social architecture around family lineage, around ancestor veneration, around the obligation of children to honor their dead. This text is not describing a supernatural belief. It may be describing the deepest social fear a Sumerian could have: to die without descendants, to be forgotten. Or, and this is where the scholars diverge, it may be doing something else entirely. Here is where the interpretation splits. And this is the honest version of the story, the one that the other channels in this wave are not telling you. Theory A says these tablets contain a real proto-empirical account. The Sumerians believed, on the basis of something, near-death experiences, shamanic traditions, visionary practices now lost, that the dead could be contacted and had reported on what lay beyond. Tablet 12 reads like a transcript because it was intended as one. The specificity, the escalating catalogue, the lack of moralizing, all of it points to a document that the people who wrote it believed was factual. Scholars like Thorkild Jakobsen argued that Sumerian cosmology was not allegorical. It was a genuine attempt to describe what the Sumerians believed to be real. Theory B says, these tablets are cosmological literature, not empirical report. They function the same way a Greek tragedy functions. They articulate a society's values through narrative. The Kur and its rules did not reflect what the Sumerians believed literally happened after death. They reflected what mattered most to them in life. The checklist of the dead is a social document disguised as a religious one. It tells you to have children. It tells you to bury your dead properly. It tells you to remember your ancestors. Translated into modern terms, it is a legal text wearing a mythological mask. Both theories have scholars behind them. Neither is proven. Neither can be proven. We do not have Sumerian testimony about their inner experience of these texts. We do not know if the priest who read Tablet 12 in a temple believed he was reciting a literal account or a moral allegory. What we know is what the tablet says. And what it says is precise, specific, and 4,000 years later, still waiting for an answer. There is one more figure in Enkidu's report, one the catalogue passed over in a single breath, so fast you may not have caught what it meant. The man whose body was burned. Go back to what Enkidu said about him. Not weeping beside his peg, not the scraps in the street like the forgotten one. Something stranger. His smoke went up to heaven. His ghost does not exist in the underworld. Every other soul descends to the Kur, the king and the slave, the man with 7 sons and the man with none, even the forgotten one, eating crumbs in the dark. He is there. He exists. The burned man does not. According to the text, he is the one death in the entire system with no destination at all. Not punished, not rewarded, not even suffering in the dark, like the forgotten. His smoke goes up, and that is all. Not judgment, absence. 4,000 years ago, someone pressed that distinction into wet clay, in a language already dying when Rome was young, and we do not know whether they meant it as cosmology, as warning, or as something they believed they had seen. That uncertainty is not a failure of archaeology. It is the most honest thing the tablets offer us. A system that makes internal sense, written by people who are trying, with the tools available to them, to answer the same question we are still asking. What happens when we die? And whether it matters how we are remembered. Here is what the archaeology confirms. The tablets are real. The excavations were real. Layard at Nineveh, Woolley at Ur, the decades of work at Nippur, documented in field reports that still exist. The translations, by Kramer, by George, by a generation of Assyriologists who built on each other's work, are as precise as the state of the discipline allows. The Epic of Gilgamesh is widely regarded as one of the oldest surviving works of literature in human history. Tablet 12 is part of it. The Kur is real, as a text, as a belief that existed, as a document of how a specific human civilization, 4,000 years ago, thought about death and what comes after. What we cannot confirm is whether it describes something true, in the sense that it maps onto an actual experience of dying, or an actual reality of what follows. The texts do not give us that. No text can. What the tablets do give us, and this is the part that gets lost in the wave of channels telling you that the Sumerians proved the afterlife, is something more valuable than a revelation. They give us a mirror. The Sumerians feared being forgotten more than they feared being punished. Their afterlife was built around that fear. Their whole civilization, its monuments, its libraries, its legal system, was built to resist it. We are doing the same thing right now, in a different language, with different tools, telling different stories, some of them pressed into clay, some of them uploaded to a server. The question the Sumerians were asking has not changed. And their answer, the one pressed into that tablet, the one that survived the fire that burned Ashurbanipal's library, the one that sat in the ground for 2,000 years before Layard found it, is still waiting to be understood. Not believed, understood. Some truths refuse to stay buried.